Ты знаешь, кто такой Гейдар Dzhemal?
So, yes, I've heard about Jamal. Читайте Платона. That's my Russian.
Oh, that's nice.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I think it's recording and the quality is good. So yeah, I was wondering, how did you come up with philosophy? I mean, that's like maybe the second question, but the first one is just who you are in general.
So, my name is Michael Millerman. I live in Canada, and I have an online school of political philosophy, millermanschool.com. My background in philosophy is that I was reading mostly, I read a lot. We had books around the house. I have an older brother and an older sister, so they were always reading things, and pretty much that's what was lying around. So what I developed an interest in was some of the books that they had in their collections, which were things like psychoanalysis, the beatniks, Jung, alchemy, astrology, but also more interestingly, mystics. So texts of various religious traditions that had a kind of mystical or spiritual dimension to them. That was the background ambiance of my learning before I went to university. And then what clicked for me was in my first year of university, I took an introduction to philosophy class where we studied Plato's Republic. And reading Plato's Republic, first of all, that was the moment that converted me to philosophy decisively and still. And one of the recognitions that I had reading the Republic, specific parts of it, was that there's an important connection between mysticism and philosophy, or between, let's say, the undescribable heights of spiritual self-transcendence on one hand, and the rigorous, logical explication of conceptual thought on the other hand. And it just was a kind of intuitive recognition at the time that what Plato's dialogue offered is what was missing from the mystics, a kind of fully conceptual explication. And at the same time, what was only suggested in Plato's dialogue, this peak philosophical transcendent experience, especially in the allegory of the cave and the idea of the good, is what the mystics could put on the table. So very early on, my first year of philosophy, I saw a possible, crucial, essential connection between philosophy and mysticism. And that was my first major step, I would say, in philosophy. And then the next major step, I'll just say, which also relates to Plato's Republic, is that over the years, I learned to see in it more than I saw at first. In particular, I learned to see in it much more the political dimension. So the Republic is a text on politics, a text on the politeia, on the regime. But my initial encounter with it, as I say, over-exaggerated its spiritual, transcendental, mystical type themes and failed to see the whole realm of what it teaches us about politics, strangely enough. And it was only through the discovery of a person named Leo Strauss. I don't know whether you've heard of him or whether your listeners or viewers have heard of him. So Strauss was the key for me who unlocked the political dimension of the philosophical tradition and turned my attention away from the purely transcendental dimension to the real question of the relationship between philosophy, theology, as it were, and politics. And that's what I continue to work on and to develop and have an interest in, both in the work on Aleksandr Dugin and in all the other philosophers that I study and teach. The intersection, you could say, between those three tendencies, the purely philosophical, if we could even isolate such a thing, the mystical, divine, elevated, spiritual, transcendental, and then its significance for our political concepts.
Yeah, considering mysticism, you said that somewhere in your interview that exactly mysticism is the link between you and the Dugin. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I would say that that's one of the links, because the first article that I ever read about Dugin is called Aleksandr Dugin, Prophet of a New Russian Empire. And it did mention his background in esoteric or occult or mystical circles, which definitely piqued my interest. But it also presented him as a kind of hidden philosopher king in Russia. And there was also part of the article that said that on a day when Dugin had been kicked out of Ukraine, I think this was in 2000, I don't remember the exact year of the article. I mean, I think the event of Dugin's having been kicked out of Ukraine was like 2009 or something. And the article said that on the same day that he had been kicked out of Ukraine, the Kremlin expelled the Ukrainian ambassador from Russia, which made me think that's strange because it's not usually the case that the state has the backs of its philosophers. You know, typically a philosopher is just somebody working in a department of philosophy and there's not much at stake in his work, and the state wouldn't expel an ambassador on behalf of a philosopher. So it was the mystical side plus his relevance for understanding Russia, as given by that anecdote. And then because I was reading The Republic, as I just mentioned, the idea of a philosopher king was very much present to mind as well. So in Dugin, there was like a Russian mystical philosopher king who's the key to understanding contemporary Russia. And since my family's from the former Soviet Union,
I know.
and I, spoke some Russian growing up, that was like, you put all of that together, and it's, I think, natural that it piqued my interest.
Okay, what do you think about Moldova right now, at the former Pacific
So
country?
I'm not very much in a position to say. I live in Canada. I was born in Canada. I grew up here. I spent most of my life here. I spent a few years in the United States. I have visited Moldova only once, for a few weeks, with a family member who grew up there, so he could show me around, give me a window onto his earlier life and so on. But I wouldn't say that I'm in a position. I have no expertise on Moldovan contemporary politics and so on. What I understand is like in so many other locations, there's a conflict over the language politics, over the identity politics. Is it primarily a part of Russia's history, post-Soviet history, Romanian history? What's the link between the Moldovan and Romanian identities? Some of that I saw with my own eyes when I was there, but beyond that, I'm not really in a position to say. It's not. I should clarify that. Because I work on Dugin so much, I translated so many of his books and have written a lot about
By
him
the way,
myself.
do you speak Russian? I'm sorry.
I do, yes. Because I've worked so much on Dugin, and because his thought clearly has a relevant practical political dimension, whether it's his analysis of the ethnic dimension of post-Soviet life, which he writes about in the fourth part of Ethnosociology, or whether it's the specifics of the Eurasian project and all of the very detailed on-the-ground dimensions of it, my preference has always been to focus on the philosophical dimension of his work. So even in one of his latest interviews, for example, that someone sent me recently on Telegram, he's talking about the war and its significance and Russia's history. And in that very context, he also mentions Nietzsche and Heidegger and the question, what is a thing, and how a Heideggerian interpretation of what a thing is differs from a nihilistic interpretation of thingness, and that Russia's understanding is closer to the Heideggerian. So he interweaves these themes, dense philosophical ones with very, let's say, practical political ones. And my tendency, my preference, for the reasons I mentioned and for other reasons as well, has always been to isolate, as it were, or really put the spotlight on the more general theoretical philosophical concerns. So that's why I couldn't really say, if you ask me specifically about today's Moldova or specifically about some other region that's implicated in political affairs, I either don't know enough to say or prefer not to comment on the specific level.
Yeah, I know that you're willing to visit Moscow. Actually, you actually said it. And you're like Russian culture, their values as well. Well, in terms of traditionalism, at least. And I know that you spoke with Dugin himself. I don't know. It seems to me that Dugin is getting crazy by time. Something is wrong with him. But
why is that?
He's just being overly aggressive or something like this. It just maybe you noticed.
Well, as I say, the last interview that I saw, so there are several things here to think about, right?
Mm-hmm.
First of all, my view is that if we're interested in the general questions that are at stake, so what kinds of questions are these? What should a country hope for? How does it understand its history? How does it make sense of the various tendencies, political, ethnic, religious, and so on, that are taking place within it, right? All the questions that Dugin has been addressing in a specific way for the last 30 or 40 years. I think one of the reasons why, if you see a change in him or something like that, so I think it was probably about not quite 10 years ago, maybe eight or so years ago, he wrote a book called Putin versus Putin. I mean, in English, it was translated. He probably wrote it maybe several years before the translation, Putin versus Putin. What was the basic thesis of the book Putin versus Putin? That Putin stopped the collapse of Russia. He kept it with some integrity. He gave it the option of restoring a specific Russian path, but he himself is on the fence. On one hand, certain Eurasian tendencies. On the other hand, certain liberal influences in his circles, and therefore he's a man divided. And he's done something good in the sense that he stopped tendencies of collapse, but he hasn't gone all the way in the direction of what he could do, hence Putin versus Putin. But since the start of the quote-unquote special military operation or war, I think that Dugin's interpretation is Putin has now, it's not Putin versus Putin. The Rubicon has been crossed. The decision has been made. The decision in favor of a Eurasian development of things. And therefore, he probably sees in that a vindication of his previous analyses and maybe is just more, I don't know, more heavily invested in them now than before because he sees that an extra step has been taken. I'm not sure. That's for other people to decide on the basis of his books and interviews and so on. But that would not be surprising, because if you do an analysis, if there's a position that you've been championing for 20, 30, 40 years, and then events gradually are conforming to your analysis, then, that sort of feedback loop, I imagine, just intensifies your desire to see things play out according to the way that you've been interpreting them. So that's what I would say. But I don't trace, I don't watch everything that he puts out all the time that he puts it out. But the most recent interviews seem to me consistent with the kinds of things that he says generally, and not an outlier.
Well, I do agree with an idea. What I'm aligning with that was an idea Putin versus Putin. It makes sense. I traced some conceptual tensions within Putin in the early interviews in early 2000, and now, it's a completely different person. But do you really think that Dugin is a Putin's brain? It seems utterly far-fetched. It seems to me that he barely spoke with Putin. Could you please comment?
Yeah, so first of all, the phrase Putin's brain comes from a 2014 article in Foreign Affairs magazine. That's the one that popularized the term. So that's where Dugin became known as Putin's brain. The title of my book, Inside Putin's Brain, The Political Philosophy of Aleksandr Dugin, means let's take a step beyond the presentation of the man who's been called Putin's brain and actually go into the primary sources to see what does he say, which isn't always done in over here anyways. I don't know who's reading him and how they're reading him in Russian-speaking parts of the world, but the interest towards him in English-speaking parts of the world can sometimes be sensationalist and superficial. Whereas my view is that, as with other thinkers, if we really want to know what Dugin believes and why, there's no substitute for the serious study of primary sources. He has many of them, and he himself has said that his biography is his bibliography. In other words, the books he's written are what matters in understanding what he thinks. So my call to action has always been, let's study the books and try to make sense of them. So the term Putin's brain, yes, is from that interview. And as for his direct or indirect influence or whatever the case is, I'll tell you how I think about it. I don't know. Have they ever met? Have they ever talked? He, in his interviews, when he's asked, he usually prefers not to answer the question. He says, I don't say. And people around him have, like Mark Sloboda, one of the translators of the Fourth Political Theory into English. He and I were interviewed simultaneously some time ago, and he had thoughts on whether they had met or not. So I don't know. Okay, but what's the more general formulation, I would say? What is the relationship between the ruler of a country like Putin, who has before him specific possibilities of action? He could develop in this direction, he could develop in this direction, he could develop in this direction. And Dugin, who behind the scenes for 30, 40 years has been writing book after book after book, article after article, think tank after think tank, elaborating the specific steps of one of those possibilities, the Eurasian one. So an analysis all the time, right? How do we make sense of the censorship regime? How do we make sense of new media technologies? How do we make sense of geopolitical events, etc.? That's what Dugin's think tanks and books and articles have been doing for decades and decades. So the way that I conceive of it is, whenever somebody in Russia, especially in a position of political leadership, decides to take the Eurasian step or decides to move, from an ideological perspective, okay, the ideology of Eurasianism, the political theory of Eurasianism, they're automatically going to be tapping into the set of concepts, ideas, phrases, manners of interpreting events, and so on that Dugin has developed. His key words, his key concepts. Why? Because he's been the most prolific person seeding the field of conceptual resources over the decades. So that's one way of seeing it. But I should say, just to be fair to the question, that there is a history of Dugin's having met high-profile figures in the Duma and high-profile political figures from other countries. You can read about that in many different places. So it's not like he's a hermit who's completely disconnected from the corridors of power and from the people who matter. You have easily verifiable evidence, direct or anecdotal, that he has met. This is written about in Charles Clover's book, Black Wind, White Snow, for example. The story about the foundations of geopolitics having become mandatory reading in military circles and so on. So he's read, he's studied, he has the right kinds of connections. Again, whether he met directly with Putin or not is somehow, I would say, not even the most interesting question. I'll tell you why. Because to meet directly with Putin or with any other president, in other words, to have a sign that two people were in the same room together, it's not obvious that that would be a more direct influence than somebody reading somebody else's book in private, or than somebody thinking somebody else's thoughts in private. In other words, Putin presumably meets with all kinds of people, Eurasianists, liberals, nationalists, Democrats, communists, this, that, and the other thing. Meets with a million people. That's no sign of their direct influence, you see? So we actually have to think through the question of what it means for a philosopher to be influential, to exert influence on political decisions, and whether direct contact is the most true sign of that kind of influence. Again, that's how I see it. Okay? Other people can interpret this question differently. My view is, you read what. Let me put just one more comment here. I don't consider myself, I hedged. Let me put it this way. Back in 2011 or so, when I started translating Dugin, it seemed to me that he helps us to understand some crucial tendencies in Russia's political present, some interpretations of its past, and some possibilities for its future. Okay? And over the last 10, 11, 12 years or so, that seems to have been verified. That whether or not they ever met, whether or not he's quote unquote Putin's brain, reading Dugin or listening to him helps us to understand actual trajectories of contemporary Russian politics and self-interpretation, both domestically and internationally, both in terms of geopolitics and in terms of these other variables or dimensions. That's the important thing. He allows us to understand something we wouldn't have understood otherwise, and events seem to show that there's some lineup. They're cohering.
I think here's two things. Well, at least first, I actually think that in terms of political system and in terms of political trajectories, Russia actually has no space to move. It's just like, it's not completely determined, but I wouldn't say that they have certain options and certain program that could be invested in various directions. It seems to be like it's like a straight line where to go. That's the first thing. And the second one is that Dugin is not alone. He is not, he's not the first and the last figure in Russian philosophy and in Russia. There's a lot of people, but they stayed unnoticed. They stayed in the shadow.
Yeah, that's true. I have something to say about that, but let's take the first point first. So is it your view that the special military operation has fundamentally changed the possibilities that are open? Or is it your view that that's true of the last, let's say, 20 years? Because, yeah, go ahead.
Could you please specify
Yeah, so
the question?
let's say, we mentioned, right, that there was a time where for Dugin and for yourself, from what you said, you could see that there were competing tendencies, like in the Putin versus Putin theme. So if there's only one path of development open to Russia now, let's say, that could be a consequence of what we said, that a decision has been made, a decision that closed off some paths of development and has set Russia basically on either you go to Eurasian multipolarity or you have a catastrophic scenario from the perspective of that kind of analysis. So,
well, yeah, I can answer that.
yeah.
Well, you just presented in a way that there is a contingency in two lines that could be somehow as a consequence of somehow some person and so forth. But for me, I see the whole picture. I see in a way that there is no space. There's only one line.
But
that
okay.
is my question.
Yes. So Dugin's analysis roughly is that, let's say, in the past 20, since 2000, there were three. I mean, there's all kinds of nuances here, okay? But you could say roughly there was a possibility of Russia's collapse.
No.
We're talking earlier, 90s, 2000s, okay? I'm not talking about right now. There was one trajectory of a, let's say, total attempted westernization or something like that, okay? One collapse of Russia's civilizational identity, all of those kinds of formulations as the Eurasianists see it from an ideological perspective. Another one was a preserving of a sort of status quo, where this is the Putin versus Putin, right? Where we don't decide, are we a unique civilization or are we a Western country? We sort of oscillate between the two and act in a state of indecision. And then thirdly, all in on the development of Eurasian trajectory. So, for example, Dugin's analysis seems to be that at least those three kinds of things were open: total collapse, indecision, or the Eurasian decision. And if recent events have tipped the scale away from the one version of the total collapse and have tipped the scales away from indecision, then yes, that would show you now it's kind of, so I said there's a Rubicon has been crossed or a decision has been made, and Russia now is further along on the development of one of those trajectories than it was when all three were open. But however we look at it, the point is that some understanding of how things could have played out, which geopolitical alliances made under which ideological imperative, culminating in what kind of attempted configuration of world order, those are things he's been writing about. For sure, he's not the only person. He's not the only Russian civilizationalist, or not the only Eurasianist, not the only thoughtful political theorist, even within his own school. Not to mention the fact that there are liberal thinkers, nationalist thinkers, communist thinkers, and many other kinds. But he does represent something specific. He represents something that seems to help us to understand, I would argue, the unfolding events. At least, again, if you listen to some of Putin's speeches, Dugin can be a kind of key to understanding the background, political theory of them. And there's one thing I want to say about that point you mentioned, okay? In my interview with him, he said that he acknowledged the fact that there's a tradition of Russian thinkers, and he stands within that tradition in a way. Okay, the Slavophiles, Solovyov, and others. But it's also important to see that for him, he's offering something crucial, essential, unprecedented, and fundamental at a philosophical level. He has a book called Martin Heidegger, The Possibility of Russian Philosophy. Not translated into English. I did translate the first part. It's now available online, but the whole book is worth reading. And his argument in Martin Heidegger, The Possibility of Russian Philosophy, it raises the question of the status or significance of the previous people who had a claim to be Russian philosophers. Okay. In other words, Dugin knows there have been these other thinkers, and roughly he knows that we categorize them as Russian philosophers. But at the same time, he raises the question, what would it mean for philosophy to be Russian? Is it just that somebody is philosophizing and they happen to be doing so in the Russian language? Or is there a fundamental significance to the language in which you philosophize, and we have to go deeper into the question, which he does with the help of Heidegger, in order to raise the question, is Russian philosophy even possible? So I don't want to bore you with the details, but I do want to say we can't, like, there are two ways to approach it. Way number one, we slot Dugin into a series of thinkers that we just treat as self-evidently related. Eurasianists, Slavophiles, all of that, slot him in, or even readers of Heidegger, Nietzsche, whatever, right? He's not Russia's only thinker. So we can slot him in and understand him in a sequence of other thinkers with a before and an after. But as I say, when we actually study his own understanding of the meaning of Russian philosophy, we get a more complicated picture. And the fact that he has a book on the topic tells us that it's not an arbitrary operation. It's one that's important to understanding how he thinks.
Yeah, I think that just the topic is circulating around, just putting my part. You seems very active, like you're giving many interviews, maybe you're working at the same time. Could you please give a tip for the efficiency or how's it going? I mean, your daily life routine or something like this.
Sure. So I work from home. I'm no longer a student. So some of the people who are listening, they may have they may work where they have to go to a job or something like that, which limits to a certain extent the flexibility, but is important in other ways. And some people, may have full student schedules to deal with, which when I was a student, I also had. So some of my flexibility, let's say, it comes from the fact that I finished my academic program and then I found work that I could do from home. So I do a lot of audio and video editing. It's part of my work. I do that on my own schedule. I teach. I no longer really translate, but I teach and study. I tutor a lot, and I have the school that I mentioned where I do courses. So I don't really have a specific tip. People have to find out for their own circumstances. Like everybody needs a different amount of sleep. If somebody maybe needs 8 hours, somebody needs 6 hours, that's going to affect how you can carve up your day. If somebody has children or doesn't, or has other obligations or doesn't. I have found that the flexibility of a work from home schedule has been a big part of why I'm able to be, how I'm able to do what I do. But there's no magic tip. I mean, everybody has to figure out from their own circumstances. Yeah, my daily routine is not very interesting. Like I'm not going to go into what I eat and drink, and it's just there's nothing there. It depends on your own circumstances. Maybe if you have something, I'll just say this: if you have something that you are extremely intensely passionate about, in my case, it's the study of philosophy and political philosophy. It has been for a long time now, and I have been able, in my case, to incorporate a lot of that, which I would be doing anyways, into what I do partly for a living through teaching and through tutoring, through writing, through discussing. I don't seek out interviews. People like yourself, you reach out, and it's my pleasure to talk to you when you did reach out. But the key thing I would say is whatever it is for yourself or for other people, like here I have a book right next to me, Plato's Laws, that I've been teaching and tutoring and that I want to do a course on. You throw yourself into what you care about. And when people find out that you care about it, they may want to talk to you about it and ask you to write about it and so on. So that's what's been the case here. There was a huge appetite for understanding Dugin in particular, but gradually other political philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and so on. So I just got lucky, I guess, that the thing that I love was also the thing that people wanted to talk to me about, and in some cases pay me for. So
yeah, I do agree. But I was wondering a tip about for younger generation who is also passionate about philosophy. And it seems to me as well that philosophy is in decline. Like overall in general in the modern period, people are not willing to study philosophy. It seems complicated. It's boring. It's and so forth. So it's just like I don't understand.
Yeah. A lot depends, in my opinion, on how a person is first exposed to philosophy. So let's say a person decides to take a university class or a college class on philosophy. I've seen it, and I know that it can happen this way, that if you get the right professor, or the right person, the right teacher, it can have such a crucial effect on your understanding and love for philosophy that it's like a conversion experience. And if you get the wrong kind of professor or teacher, it can destroy all love for philosophy that you might have had nascent within you, because they just make the topic seem like it's dry and unerotic and uninteresting and irrelevant and so on. So the question of the proper introduction to philosophy becomes very important. It's not boring. It's thrilling. It's not useless. It's extremely practical in every respect. But how a person first gets exposed to it, and whether they, if they had a bad first exposure, it's harder for them to come back to it in the right way. But I would encourage, don't read some contemporary. I mean, people can read whatever they want. They should start wherever they want. But my advice is go to the best of the best thinkers with the help of the best teachers, commentators, and guides. Read Heidegger, read Plato, start and keep going. And if something seems, some people may, like I think you mentioned in the piece you sent me, stoicism. So maybe someone's reading Aurelius or Epictetus, or they find some phrases of Socrates that resonate with them. But it's a treasure house. It's the most amazing thing. All of the people that have changed my life for the better, writers and so on, for all of them, philosophy is in the first and foremost place to understand yourself and the world, to know the meaning of the nature of political life, about law, beauty, love, justice, courage, whatever it is that matters to you on a human level, or even on a, as it were, superhuman level. For some people, reading Nietzsche will be the magic bullet because of the intensity of his rhetoric. But don't ever turn your back on philosophy, would be my advice for the people who have an interest in a serious and well-lived human life. Plato, Heidegger, there's just no words for it. Read, I showed you this book. I dare anybody, as it were, to read the first 10 pages or 5 pages or 2 pages of this book and then to just put it down and not come back to it. It's not possible. You read 2 pages and you'll recognize that Plato and the kinds of questions he raises are on another level. They'll reach more deeply into the things that matter and that you care about. But it does take some time. It does take some effort. It isn't always easy. In some cases, it takes a lot of work, and you do have to stick around for it. But it's worth it. And philosophy should be front and center, I think, for anybody who's trying to understand themselves in the world.
Yes, it seems to me that your native find was within 2 countries. Well, Moldova, as we mentioned, and Canada. What do you think about the real figures there, Maia Sandu and Justin Trudeau?
Oh, so as I mentioned, I wouldn't want to comment on Moldovan politics because I just get too far removed and so on. And frankly, I'm not a big fan of Canada's current government for many reasons. But as I say, there's always been a problem for thoughtful people who care about, let's say, how can I put this? I'm not a fan of Canada's current government. Okay? I'm not a fan of Justin Trudeau. I don't think the country is being well run and so on. But that's the problem of how to run a country well. The problem of what is good political leadership. What can you expect from politics, even in the best case? Those are the questions that are more interesting to me. Okay, this is not the first time that there's been a country with a government that its citizens don't like, either because it's too extreme in one direction or it's too extreme in another direction, because it's favoring one class over another class, because its understanding of education is twisted. There are many, many ways that governments can go wrong. And there are not that many ways that governments can go right. Like Aristotle says in the Ethics, if virtue or excellence is a mean middle between 2 extremes, there's one target there's one bullseye, and there are many things that are far from it. So there are so many ways that governments can go wrong. They can go wrong in the direction of democracy. They can go wrong in the direction of autocracy. There can be not enough freedom. There can be too much freedom. So that's the fact that a government could be doing something wrong is no big surprise. The big surprise is that governments ever do anything right. And the people who help us to understand, again, not to be not to sound like a propagandist on behalf of classical political philosophy or anything, but we can't even think clearly about politics at the level that matters most without the help of people like Plato and Aristotle. But then you see how big of a gap there is between what government looks like in the best case scenario and what it looks like on any given day. So my there are commentators whose job it is to talk all day about the politics of their country. Here's their tax policy, here's our housing policy, here's our criminal policy, here's why bread is too expensive, et cetera, right? Political philosophy is a more fundamental, more general topic than that, and that's where I prefer to put my attention. Let's put it this way: if I were to give you an exaggerated statement, all the improvement that could come to governments, whether they're in Canada or in Moldova or anywhere else, is a function of how seriously they take education in the foundations of political thought. And when your attitude towards that question, education in the foundations of political thought, is so narrow that you're only reading books written in the last 10 years, or you're only reading Enlightenment authors or modern authors or liberal authors, it's too narrow a field of vision. It's not possible. Education, the kind of education that allows somebody to rule well and to legislate well and to be concerned with what's required for a good political community, it needs much more breadth and depth than that. So the fundamental question from my perspective is a question of education. Education in the great books of political philosophy. The broader and the deeper our study of that topic, the more we can hope for from our governments. The more narrow and distorted and zealous and partisan and ideological our exposure to that question is, the less that we can hope for. Whether because we're too liberal or not liberal enough, too free or not free enough. As I say, there are many ways to go wrong and few ways to go right.
Yeah. Have you checked my essay, or I'll
Yes.
send you a link?
Yes.
What do you think about it?
Well, I like that you found that it turned to Stoic philosophers, unless I don't know how tongue-in-cheek it is. I assume that it's genuine, that despite the questions of race, ethnicity, geopolitical belonging, and all the rest of it, that there's some deep human dimension that the Stoic philosophy is able to speak to and to give you some sort of some orientation for your life. Is that accurate?
A friend of mine, he was interested in Stoicism. That's where it came from.
And did you start reading something there that you found helpful?
Yeah, I've read everything.
Okay. And did you find that it cuts through to some extent the ethnic and linguistic and other kinds of questions to something more? Or how do you think about how those two things relate?
Well, first of all, the very essay was written against Aleksandr Dugin and his political program. And it's all goes along with his philosophy. And the thing about my ethnicity, race, it doesn't really matter. It just, I use that in the kind of way of criticism against him. But I think that Stoicism, when I first went to that direction, it seems interesting, but it's not that deep as I thought. But even though there is a lot of figures that goes beyond way from popular philosophers, Stoic philosophers like Marcus Aurelius, which is not even a decent philosopher for my perspective, and all of that just intertwined with like contemporary period. I think that Stoicism is trending right now, but it's not that deep as I thought.
So what are you finding now deep, interesting, and helpful?
Political philosophy.
Anybody in particular?
Carl Schmitt, Leo Strauss, Martin Heidegger, and Alfred Whitehead as well.
I see. Okay, well, I mean, I share with you the view that Strauss, Schmitt, and Heidegger, Whitehead, I only have read a little bit of. No, nothing on political philosophy from Whitehead that I
I
know
think
about.
Whitehead is better than for me. For me, he's equal figure to Martin Heidegger, and
Okay.
I think he's very interesting. My diploma was kind of touching this persona. Yes, and I was. It doesn't really matter. I was trying to say that I was the one who is criticizing Aleksandr Dugin from my perspective, from the perspective that Eurasianism is a kind of ideology out of pan-Slav people, I mean Russian people. They trying to get the power from their own like perspective. And for me, as an Asian person, it's it's completely humiliating. You know, yeah, I'm feeling myself like an immigrant, like a foreigner. For like, if I'm gonna say that I'm Russian, people would laugh at me in my face,
Hmm.
even though I'm Trishan.
Hmm. I see. Well, look, I'm obviously in no position to comment on how you experience from there Dugin's analysis. That's again, that's the same reason that in some sense I don't want to comment on Moldovan politics. I'm sitting over here in Canada in a completely different situation, but I can say that um, at a theoretical level, my understanding is that Dugin is not a Russian nationalist. That Russian nationalists do not like Eurasianists, uh, partially because Eurasianism is broader than and has a more positive attitude towards other ethnoses and peoples. Isn't as narrowly, let's say, merely Russian. Isn't a narrow kind of Russian nationalism. But it's a. I admit that it's a complicated question theoretically. Dugin has a book called Ethnosociology, and I don't know whether his analysis, let's say, of the ethnosociology of post-Soviet Russia, which he has towards the end of that book, if you have read it or if you did read it, whether you would find it to be objectionable or not. I only know, that it's a question that he's written about, studied. I know for a fact that is not a narrow nationalism or a narrow racism, that has a broader reach than that. I know that he's tried in his political theory to be just, let's say, to the to how could you put it, not to a narrow. Yes, it's true for him that there's a kind of. Anyways, the ethnosociology of his political theory is a complicated one in my opinion, but I could not presume to comment on how you experience it in practice. There, I only know it as a theoretician from far away. So,
Uh, yeah, I've read three books of Dugin's books, and I couldn't find any particular program out of fourth political program. He's just inviting for like global or something like global thinking. Let's just think about the fourth political program. That is his outline of the book. And can you can you describe something more about this?
yeah, I've written a lot about Dugin's political theory. I've got courses on it, and I've many publications and books. I kind of don't want to go over all of that ground again. I think
Yeah,
a useful way to think about it, again, a useful way to think about it is at the high level of theory or ideology or philosophy, the basic terms of analysis. So once again, not necessarily how do we deal with the fact that there's been inflation and the price of bread is now 20% higher than it was before, or the extremely detailed minutia of day-to-day policy. The question for him, like for others, like for Schmitt, like implicitly for Heidegger, like for Strauss, is the question of our basic concepts, of our key categories, of how we interpret the meaning of history and whether history is even should be our primary reference point. For example, Leo Strauss has a book called Natural Right in History, where he argues that history should not be our primary reference point. And he argues against the tendency in political thought to emphasize history as a consideration. And so there are these seemingly abstract debates that look like they have nothing to do with practical political policies and events, that seem too general to be political programs, like you just mentioned. But the debate there is taking place at the level of these basic concepts. So in Dugin's writings, that's true as well, I think, partially, because he's trying to reorient the basic concepts of interpretation away from the thought that if you're not a liberal and you're not on the left of liberalism, you're automatically a fascist. That's the idea of the three political theories: liberal, communist, fascist / Nazi. And he says we need to have a richer conceptual arsenal, a richer political vocabulary. Otherwise, we're going to get stuck in the limitations of this old model of three political theories, a model that is not allowing us to think clearly and not allowing us to act freely. And his proposal is that you can, by incorporating some of the concepts or words or ideas of Heidegger and of the traditionalists and of other movements, including, he's developed this, as I say, for a long time and over many books, by beginning to include notions from these other sources, you can at least have the concepts that allow you to think and talk and analyze and plan more freely than if you're stuck with the ideologies of liberalism, communism, and fascism. So it's not meant to be I would say, you shouldn't look for an immediately implementable political project in it. Now, there are elements of that. There are elements of, this is the relationship that Russia should have with such and such other countries, against the NATO countries. Here's the kind of geopolitical order we should be striving for. He does have some things like that, but the more general question is, how do we even begin to talk about our history, our future, and our present outside of the language that we're so used to, in particular, the language of those three political theories? And that requires some work, because it requires going over the genesis of the model that liberalism, communism, and fascism exhaust the political spectrum. It involves going before modernity. It involves going even deeper into post-modernity. It's like it's a task of freeing up the semantic potentials for the interpretation of political life.
I think regarding Russia, I think that they could do much better in terms of political management. For example, in 2016, 17, when the right wing blah 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 comes in, they could play with that, but they didn't. They couldn't. They didn't actually do anything. And I don't think the quality of the intelligence from the administration is high. I think it seems to me that you could actually play with right wing games and stuff like that, but I see nothing, and we're just stuck here in Russia. What do you think about right?
That may be. I assume you see, because you are there, and because you live there. I assume you see these things more clearly than I do. That's why I say that on the ground, I trust your eyes more than my study of the books. So that's why I can only comment on the theoretical side of things.
Yeah, but I'm trying to touch right wing, for example, conservatism or something like this. What do you think about conservatism right now?
So again, if we go to the question of how we understand these concepts, like I've been teaching right now a book called Germany's Third Empire by Arthur Müller-Vandenbroek. Okay, he wrote this 1922, 1923. And in this book, he distinguishes between conservative and reactionary. And he has a very specific interpretation of what it is to be a conservative and how that differs from reactionary and how it differs from liberal. In the American context, if you say conservative, I mean, like the North American context, Canada, the United States, if you say conservative, people think that means you want lower taxes, free market economy, free speech, individual liberties, and so on. If you say conservative for Arthur Müller-Vandenbroek in 1923, it means something completely different. It means you're thinking about the destiny of the people, their historical mission, higher spiritual values. So it's another example of the fact that we have this problem of interpretation because these words can mean such different things, including what it means to be a right wing or far right, or all of that. So Strauss, that's why I say, why do I teach people like Dugin, Strauss, Schmitt, Heidegger? Remember, it's not all about Dugin. Dugin's one part of a big picture, in my opinion. He's an important part of it, but he's one part of it. You need these other thinkers as well. You need to be studying Schmitt, Heidegger, Dugin, Strauss, Plato, Aristotle, and everybody else, so that we can see what kind of movement are we referring to when we talk about the right. What would be an intelligent or an unintelligent response to tendencies like the rise of right-wing energies or movements or tendencies? When is that destructive and when isn't it? So in Plato's Laws, to give you an example, this is thousands of years ago, okay, Plato's book called The Laws. It's got nothing to do directly with contemporary Russia or Moldova or Canada, and yet it shows you that the principles of analysis, they transcend our space and time, our place and time, because in The Laws, Plato raises a question. Is it good for a political community to be overly homogenous, let's say, like a very narrow national identity? Okay. And no, there's a problem there, because when it's extremely narrow and homogenous, it becomes difficult to introduce new legislation that improves, because people already have such a fixed identity in their group that it becomes difficult to legislate for them in a way that's going to improve the situation. But if it's too disparate, too heterogeneous, too dissipated and atomistic, it also becomes very difficult for the statesman or for the legislator. It also limits what he can do to improve the basis of the political community. So when we talk about, let's say, right-wing movements or right-wing parties, if you mean that they're like narrowly ethnic, ethno-nationalists or narrowly racist or something like that, well, obviously there are all kinds of problems that come with that. But at the same time, if you go to the opposite extreme and you have people whose political teaching is a denial of all ethnic identity and a denial of all national identity and a total denial of all group cohesion, well, that has its own set of difficulties and problems. So it's a very challenging thing to understand what is good statesmanship in any given case. What is the most that could be expected, even in the best case scenario? And since nobody has the best case scenario ever, then once we know the best that could be expected, then you also have to adjust your expectations downward. So you say the government didn't exploit such and such a situation to its benefit, or maybe it could have done more, or maybe it should have done less. But you would have to say, what do you think they could have done, and how would that have helped or hurt the situation? These kinds of analyses are not straightforward, in my opinion. You know what I mean?
Yes, I do agree. Yeah, it goes back to the ancient classics, I understand. The world is getting black and white, especially we just mentioned Dugin's political philosophy. He's always accusing people for being like how's it called, globalist. There is a globalist and there is an anti-globalist. This it's just like a black and white thing. What do you think about that?
So, in the case of Dugin, it's true that he sometimes makes a simple division: globalist, anti-globalist, Great Reset, Great Awakening, Atlanticist, Eurasianist,
Putin
the rest and the West. Okay, there are many examples of that. But it's also the case that when you go further down the levels of analysis, they start to include more categories. So even the notion of a fourth political theory, right, now is starting to get a little bit into the details, and then so on. So his model is more complicated than a simple division between two alternatives, although he does often present it that way. And it's rhetorically effective, even though it's an oversimplification. Okay. I have found in talking to people who want to know about it that, especially if they're looking for a kind of simple explanation, which some people are, fair enough. Not everybody wants to go into the nuances of a Husserlian or Heideggerian analysis of politics, they may already be falling asleep and, wanting to get something more exciting when you talk to them about that. So his divisions, they have the benefit of quickly highlighting a fundamental difference, one that can map onto several different domains or areas, but that risks being oversimplification or an exaggerated presentation. But I do think it can be helpful at times. I mean, I wrote something on the Great Reset versus the Great Awakening and gave an interview about it, where a lot of people found it to be a helpful division between one tendency that goes in the direction of overcoming group identity, gender identity, even human identity, political identity, national identity. That is a kind of trend or tendency on one hand. And on the other hand, the people who are trying to defend some sense of that, of communal identity, whether it's they're defending the difference between men and women, or they don't want to take a step into the destruction of the human essence or human nature. They're trying to put the brakes on transhumanist tendencies, or they just are kind of automatically nationalistic or have a cultural or civilizational identity and intuit that the quote unquote globalist forces are working towards the destruction of those types of identities. So there's a simple level and there's a slightly more complicated level. And I think that's by design. It's deliberate. And I also think there's a place for that, because if you're addressing a broad audience, within that broad audience, there will be some people like yourself who have thought a little bit and read a little bit and understand a little bit, and who can follow in a difficult argument. But there will be many people who can't. And what they have ready to hand is opinions that are shared by many, intuitions, hunches. And it's important to address that too if you're trying to communicate to many people simultaneously. And so I think Dugin's divisions, Atlanticist is like a quick word. I mean, sometimes he says Atlanticist, sometimes he says Satanist, sometimes he says something else. So these are quick words that draw on a set of associations and that convey an impression, even without the benefit of a detailed analysis. But the people who want the detailed analysis can go and get it. They still disagree with it, but I see him as somebody who operates on those levels simultaneously, which in other cases in some cases you have, let's say, a theoretician and his propagandist, and then, like 3 different people doing what Dugin does by himself. Dugin is his own propagandist. He's his own theoretician. He speaks in broad terms to the broad masses and in narrower terms to the narrow group of people that he thinks are, let's say, interested in philosophy and theology and so on.
Is there any parallel between Aleksandr Dugin and Leo Strauss? Because it was a history with Leo Strauss that he is responsible for foreign policy in 2004 when the U.S. government invented the invasion into Iraq. And here people think the same.
Yeah. I think that there's a very nice connection between Dugin and Strauss, and that it's worth thinking about the two of them together. So in my book, Inside Putin's Brain, I do have a chapter on Strauss and Dugin that tries to do that kind of comparison. So let me say some of the similarities. Both of them are critical of political modernity. They both are suspicious towards Enlightenment rationalism and towards what they see as the crisis of modern rationality. They both seem to have a sense that we have to return to the sources of our traditional understanding. And for both of them, that means fundamentally going back to Plato. For sure, in the case of Strauss, who has a book called Studies in Platonic Political Philosophy, and also for Dugin, who has a book, I translated in English, called Political Platonism. So they're both concerned about the crisis of modernity. They both seek answers in a return to Platonic philosophy. That's already a very nice commonality. They both acknowledge Martin Heidegger as the crucial philosopher of our era. And they both seem to think that the return to Plato should pass through a serious study of Heidegger. That's an amazing set of commonalities, in my opinion. Moreover, Each of them sought in some way to influence the development of political affairs. Dugin in the obvious ways through his think tanks and media channels and so on, and Strauss in the less obvious way by founding a school of political philosophy as an educator. He didn't have the benefit of a YouTube channel and of a million websites and all of the other sorts of things, but he did have the benefit of thoughtful disciples at the University of Chicago and the effect of having been their teacher. So he did start a school of thought. So these are crucial commonalities. And that allows us also to study the very crucial differences between them, because they have totally different expectations from the relationship between philosophy and politics. I'll put it this way. It may seem like an obscure point, but Dugin seems to want to, I mean, this is the way that I think about it, okay? Dugin takes, there's so much here that I want to say, but I also don't want to get lost in the details. So let me just take a step back. The commonalities that I mentioned, they culminate in some fundamental differences, okay? And studying those differences will help us to understand something important. Strauss never expected as much from the politicization of philosophy or from the philosophization of politics as Dugin seems to expect. So Dugin specifically says, when we think about Russian politics and when we think about global politics, we should use Heidegger's language. We should think in terms of Dasein. We should interpret Russia's political history in light of Heidegger's account of the history of being. You know, it's like he brings philosophy and politics closer than Strauss does. For Strauss, there's a bit of a gap. Dugin seems at times to want to close that gap. But we couldn't even begin to make sense of that difference if we don't follow their commonalities. So again, crisis of modernity for both of them, yes. Importance of Plato and need to return to Plato, yes. Passing through the Heidegger factor, yes. And then we can begin to try to understand why they differ as well. I'll say this one thing. I just have to say this because in the context of this question, it's a good opportunity. I used to entertain the thesis, okay, or just play with the idea, half jokingly, so not totally seriously, but not completely frivolously, that Dugin is what Strauss would have been if Strauss had been born in Russia. That's more like a thought experiment, okay, than, like I say, a completely serious thesis. Half.
That sounds funny. Yeah. Yeah, I want to also get into liberalism. Okay. How do you define liberalism, especially when people tend to divide between liberalism and neoliberalism and blah, 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 you know, stuff like that?
It's another word, like fascism, it's another word with a lot of meanings and, you know, one that gets used in a lot of ways. Today, look, what are the divisions that you see? Let's say in your context, if you call somebody a liberal or somebody calls somebody a liberal or you talk about liberalism, what does it evoke, if anything, automatically?
What do you mean?
For you, if you hear somebody saying that they're a liberal or that they call somebody a liberal, does it bring any, like, can you infer anything about their position on certain topics or for sure what, if not what they're for, at least what they're against?
I think it involves two layers. First is from political stance. When you're aligning with political democracy and you're criticizing hierarchy, you want to get like into vertical seat. That's the first thing. Even though if people not articulating this position, they could seems to be very much like these points. And the second one is more the personal, when you're like autonomous individual, atomized, when you're not into any traditional values, you think for yourself, quote unquote, and so forth. That is how I define being liberal, for me at least. Well, it's superficial definition.
It's not completely superficial. I mean, it captures something about how people identify today as liberal and what we mean when we use the word. So I think that's a fair starting point. preference for equality over hierarchy, a preference for our general universal humanity as opposed to our particularity. Differences, they're it's not always going to pan out this way. And you're free to live however you want. I'm not going to be judgmental about it. I'm not going to impose on you my vision of the good. You have a right to do what you want to do and to pursue what you want to pursue, and I'm not going to limit your right by telling you what I think is good or bad or just or unjust or whatever the case is. So the priority of the right to the good, you could say, and other positions like that. So in some sense, you could say that very generally, to be an anti-liberal is to think that the hierarchy or the vertical dimension should take priority over the equality in the horizontal dimension.
Yes.
That the question of the good is more fundamental than the question of individual right.
Yes.
And that judgment has a place in politics. And it shouldn't just be that everybody should be non-judgmental and, that you always have to be worried first and foremost about offending somebody's feelings. No, maybe first and foremost, you have to be setting out the principles of political order, whether they offend somebody or not. So there are all kinds of varieties then of anti-liberalism, depending on what you think the good happens to be, how you understand the construction of the vertical dimension, how strict or rigorous you want to be in judging people who are falling short or, who are not following the line. So there's a lot of room for difference there. But that's what I would say. I mean, what you capture when you say, when you said what you said is roughly what people mean. Then you can get into hair splitting. Well, classical liberal means this, and neoliberal means that, and post-liberal means that, and progressive liberal means this. But they all share roughly, a common, they all fall on one side. And on the other side is this other view where rights follow from the question of the good. They don't precede it. The vertical dimension should be decisive and not just secondary or tertiary and so on.
In terms of geopolitics, what do you think about raising China and India as a country and as a political player, in terms of economics, in terms of ideology? Well, overall, just maybe a few comments.
I'll tell you the puzzle for me in some sense. Okay.
Yeah.
So as a Canadian, as a Canadian citizen, somebody who lives here, just like I assume is the case, for other people in other countries, I don't, China has been, let me put it this way. I'll stick to the general theoretical question as I see it. Okay. Let's say you have two alternatives: unipolarity, multipolarity. Very simple. Okay, Dugin, a theorist of multipolarity. I think it's not so simple as to be not applicable. Okay, because when we say the rise, people understand the rise of China, rise of India means rise of civilizational poles in the world that have some element of sovereignty and influence, and that are not completely either emasculated and impotent, or that are not completely under the dictates of the United States, of a single global hegemon. So very simply, unipolarity, multipolarity. Now, the question of the rise of of China and India and Russia too, I guess in this context, could mean, what are the benefits of multipolarity? So are there risks, dangers, and all of that? Yes, presumably there are. For example, interference of one country into another country's affairs, and so on and so on. The more powerful, let's say, China becomes, the more aggressive it can also become on the world stage. Just as when America became powerful, America became aggressive on the world stage. So power and aggression, they go hand in hand here, and you could say that could be a possible risk. But what's the benefit of multipolarity? So one is peoples have some element of self-determination. They may get to decide how they want to live, if that's not the same way that they would otherwise be told to live. I think there's something to that. In each case, you kind of have to negotiate that in your own place. It's not for, let's say, it's not for a Canadian to say how Indians should live or the Chinese should live or all of that. But at the theoretical level, I'll tell you the one that's most interesting to me. In the fourth political theory, the version that was published in English, at least, Dugin says near the end of the book the following: the multipolar world, he says, must be noetic in some way. Noetic like nous, Greek word for intellect. So that's a weird statement. Why would there be a statement that combines multipolarity, which is an apparently purely geopolitical concept, with nous, which is apparently a purely philosophical concept or idea? That's bizarre. That would be my starting point. What is the link, if any, between multipolarity and noetic analysis? So here we're not guessing, because it happens to be the case that Dugin has written a series of books called Noomachia. Noomachia is a philosophical analysis of civilizational multipolarity. Noomachia is Dugin's attempt to explain the noetic dimension of a multipolar world. And in the first 2 volumes of that book, where he sets out the underlying theory of it, he says that why multipolarity? Why would we want multipolarity? What is the philosophical significance of multipolarity? It's that nous itself is multidimensional or internally articulated. And that global politics, if it is to be adequately philosophical, should reflect the inner articulation of nous itself. So in his thought, like in other, if you have Kantian liberal internationalism or Kantian liberal universalism, it's a similar thing, relating a philosophical idea about the nature of human reason to our expectations of world order, right? In Schmitt, and on all of these other thinkers, you have a basic philosophical idea correlated with the basic vision of world order. In Dugin's case, the correlate is multipolarity, geopolitically. Why? Because we have a fundamental plurality at the noetic or existential level. So that to me is interesting. And that would be, I think that's worth thinking about. But that's not purely geopolitical. You see, that's squarely in the field of political philosophy. Another way of putting it is this: does geopolitics have any philosophical significance? I think somebody could say no. Somebody could say maybe. Somebody could say yes. Does geopolitics have any philosophical significance at all? Well, it seems for sure to affect the, as it were, philosophical mood or the transmission of philosophical ideas. So that, for example, after the Second World War, in the Western world, authors who were considered right-wing were censored or distorted or defamed, and it's still it's still dangerous, sort of, or still like taboo to be interested in Heidegger and Schmitt and thinkers from the right, because we still live in the shadow of the Second World War. So in some sense, there is a clear relationship between, let's say, geopolitical events like wars and the status of philosophy, what you can read or can't read. Or like Dugin says in his second Heidegger book, the regime type of the Soviet Union and its basic ideological contours, it affected the reading of Heidegger, because Heidegger was read sort of in the light of the Soviet ideology, which distorted the understanding of Heidegger. So, that's where I would encourage people who are interested in our discussion anyways, and how I try to think about it. What is the philosophical significance of geopolitics, if there is one at all? Why should there be one? And if there is one, then how do we think about the relationship between multipolarity in philosophy, unipolarity in philosophy? Leo Strauss, incidentally, in his book On Tyranny, where he has a debate with Aleksandr Kojev, Strauss, says in his debate with Kojev, in his restatement in On Tyranny, that a unipolar world, a world with one center of power, a global tyranny, a globalism under a single tyrant, would be an unprecedented human situation that would be disastrous for philosophy. It wouldn't just be disastrous politically. It wouldn't just be disastrous for everybody who suffers from the tyranny of the universal tyrant. It would also be disastrous for philosophy. So you see, it's not only Dugin who thinks about the relationship between world order and the status of philosophy. It's also people like Strauss. So that's what I would say about that. I mean, independently of that, you have, yes, rise of China means whatever else it happens to mean for global economy and markets and Chinese national self-determination and the treatment of minorities and this, that, and the other thing. But philosophically, the question is, what does it mean at the level of how we interpret ourselves in the world?
Isn't it ancient Greece was homogeneous as well?
Say that again?
Isn't it ancient Greece was homogeneous as well? It was quite close.
Well, you have, again, if you reading from Plato, you do have differences between, let's say, the Achaeans and Dorians, or the Spartans and the Cretans and the Athenians. That comes up as a relevant difference in the dialogues. You do also have the example in the laws of the Egyptians, not to mention the Persians.
Yeah, Egyptians.
So they're aware of, and they can still discuss different regime types because they have within Greece the difference between, let's say, the Athenian and the Spartan at a minimum. They also have the ancient and the modern Athenian regimes. So they have the tyranny and the democracy to think about, not to mention the oligarchy and all the rest of it. And then they have the foreign examples of Egypt and Persia. So they have enough to draw on in order to see the spectrum of political possibilities.
Yeah, but in terms of republic, like Commonwealth, I'm not talking about temporality there. In terms of like political concept.
Yes, it's a more narrowly homogenous. It's not a global, for sure. It doesn't include all kinds of peoples and places. Yeah, for sure. What's interesting to me, as I mentioned, in the laws, there's explicitly this discussion where they say, because the characters in the laws, just one of the things that they end up doing is they're legislating for a colony, a new colony. So there's an Athenian, a Spartan, and a Cretan, and they're all in a conversation about the nature of law. And the Cretan informs the Spartan and the Athenian that he is going to be leading the establishment of a colony, and maybe they can walk through in their conversations some of what he should be thinking about when he legislates for the colony or when he is developing it. And so the character called the Athenian stranger, he asks this Cretan, he says, well, who will be in the colony? Is it going to be like a narrow ethnic stock, like everybody from the same ethnicity, so to speak? Or are you going to be inviting colonists from all over Greece? Or is it going to be very homogenous, or is it going to be relatively heterogeneous? And they discussed, as I mentioned earlier, the difficulties of both. So even though that's true that they didn't have the example of globalism, they were aware of the problem that if you're too diverse, then it's difficult to have a shared way of life. But a shared way of life is necessary for a certain kind of Republican political community that maybe is the only political community that allows for virtue, or let's say morality, or good living. So there are deep puzzles and problems. And there are arguments, obviously, on behalf of the other side as well, on behalf of liberal universalism, globalism, the overcoming of nation states, and so on. So I think we have to be aware of both sides of the picture. I tend to agree with Strauss, Schmitt, Heidegger, Dugin, and the other thinkers who say that closed political societies are necessary for a good human life. But it's not straightforward. It's a big question.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to touch two figures. Maybe some thoughts. First, already said about Alfred Whitehead, and the second is Bruno Latour. Have you heard?
So I have not read either one, and I couldn't comment. I know that Dugin mentions Latour. He sees him as an important figure, and he's written about him, I think, in the ethnosociology book. But I can't comment because they're not people I study. I study and teach a pretty narrow group of thinkers, but I read their books quite deeply. But at Latour, I can't say. Is he the one who wrote about "We've Never Been Modern"?
Yes.
Okay, so I know Dugin mentions that piece of writing. That's the only way that I know it. And Whitehead,
they both very influential right now at the moment.
Okay. Maybe you want to say what you've learned from them or what you think about them. Again, I can't comment because I just don't know.
I don't care about them. I just want to ask about you. It's I don't like them as well. I mean, except Alfred Whitehead and his particular elements from metaphysics. Anyway, Um, there, there's a tragedy that happened with Aleksandr Dugin and his daughter. I don't know what exactly happened, but what do you think about as being from the stance as a philosopher, having a child, a daughter that actually intertwined and involved into politics? It's just pretty cruel life. What do you think?
Yeah, I can't imagine. I can't imagine what that would be like. I know that he's commented on it before, and I think that there was his followers in the Eurasian movement. I think that they put out many statements and writings of hers and tried to understand her life and death in terms of her destiny and her work. But I couldn't imagine, in the interview that I referred to, where he spoke recently and mentioned Nietzsche and Heidegger, among other things. He was asked about that, and you just see that it's a very, as I think is easy to understand, very painful. It's just probably indescribable what it is like to lose a son or a daughter like that. But at the same time, as you see from the follow-up work of his Eurasian movement, they interpret, as I understand, her life and death as a kind of mission or a destiny, and try to think in terms of the contribution she made to the discourse. I don't know. I have not. I don't know about his daughter and her writings, but I only know that it must be a horrible experience for any parents to lose a child, whether they're philosophers or not philosophers. And I just couldn't. I couldn't imagine.
Yeah,
I've got children of my own, and I can only imagine it's
yeah,
a
you've got
horrible thing to go through. But I wouldn't. I wouldn't know what to say about it beyond that.
Do you think Dugin is responsible for that as a father?
No, I don't. But
No.
yeah.
And the last question. Ты знаешь, кто такой Гейдар Джемал?
So yes, I've heard about Jamal in the circles that he was in with Dugin in the 80s and so on. I can say I have never read Jamal, but if I'm not mistaken, in the book In Search of the Dark Logos, which is a kind of preface, I would say, to the Noomachia series, In Search of the Dark Logos is a good book, and I think it's worth reading. There, if I recall correctly, he's got a chapter on Jamal as an example of somebody who's in the quote unquote dark logos. But again, I haven't studied Jamal, so I wouldn't feel like I'm like I could say anything meaningful beyond that.
I heard his lectures. I mean, many lectures of Geydar Dzhemal,
What
and
do you think about them?
I think he's a strong figure. He's much better than Dugin. And Dugin himself, he approved that Geydar Dzhemal его учитель, and he died also in a tragic way. But for me, as I said, Geydar Dzhemal is much great thinker than Alexander Dugin. That's like in a nutshell.
That may be. That may be. Look, I want to make something clear. Okay, I think it's
Yes.
important to make something clear. Although I've done a lot of work on Dugin in the last decade, okay, translations, interviews, courses, publications, okay, my book of essays on him, I said, my view of people like Dugin, like Strauss, they give us something to think about. And it's not, we don't have to say, we believe Dugin is the greatest thinker who ever lived, or his interpretation of Heidegger is the best interpretation of Heidegger there ever was, or his vision of Eurasianism is what Russia needs to follow, or that he's a better thinker than his contemporaries. The value of the people that we study is that they give us something to think about. And if you found, as you read Jamal, that he gives you more to think about, or he analyzes questions more deeply, or you think that he's correct in places where Dugin is incorrect, or that he's raised questions that Dugin hasn't raised, or that he's raised them more thoughtfully, then that's what you follow and what you pursue and what you think about. So I'm not Dugin is better than Dzhemal, or is this person. When you find somebody who introduces you into substantive thinking about the things that you care about, then that's a gift and that's a blessing, whoever it happens to be. For me, in my case, Dugin was one of the figures, and I tried to explain what I found valuable in his work. But in no way does it imply that he's the only one, or that there aren't people that disagree with him that are worth reading equally seriously, or that put emphasis on different questions. Like, I don't think Dzhemal, from what I understand anyways, they were in the same circles, so they're not enemies of one another, but the emphasis may be completely different, and so on. So just to be clear, like, we read these people because we have something to learn from them, whoever they happen to be, whether they agree with one another or disagree with one another. These aren't sports teams in some sense that we're just blindly following. It's an amazing thing to find somebody whose interpretations shed light on the world for you. So did you want to say something? I would be interested to hear why you think, what you saw in Dzhemal that you found valuable and that you would recommend.
Yeah, but nevertheless, I think the thing that you said, it sounds like very liberal. When you're taking this and that from here and that, you're combining your own virtue as you think, and I don't think this way. I think when you're taking a person, you're also taking care about the history and his life and his philosophy as well. I don't trying to separate them. I'm not trying to be much more analytical. And when you're trying to fragment it, the person, the individual, and take all of that from the best, this is not my personal worldview.
Okay, so what did you want to say? It would be helpful for me to hear what you find in Dzhemal that you think is most valuable or most interesting, or that you recommend above all.
Yeah, but you see, you have to understand, so to speak, my personal life, I would say, because I'm Turkic, right? And Geydar Dzhemal, he is Turkic as well. He's half Azerbaijan, right? And it immediately make much more sense for me that he is even closer to me by blood, and he was Muslim, and I'm like aligning with pessimism, and he was a pessimist as well. And I'm not like, this is not my lecture, okay? I'm not willing to discuss for a long time, and we're also running out of time. There's like 1 hour and a half. But I think he was really interesting. You should have maybe find some lectures on YouTube. He has he has a YouTube channel. I mean, maybe some from his followers created that. You might find it interesting. It seems he was a close friend of Dugin, and he's his teacher, right? So it's like very close mentality, right?
So do you find and do you think that it is important when you read a philosopher or let's broadly characterize them as philosophers, okay, that you can relate to their, as you said, to the question of blood or identity or ethnicity or personal history, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. Helps? That's my question. I mean, the answer to the question.
Okay,
do you know why?
Why?
Because you're not okay.
No, hold on. Let me just say, I don't disagree. I mean, Strauss is a German Jew. That's helpful for me as somebody who's got German Jewish roots. Dugin is somebody who writes in Russian, and I'm reading him. Partially that helped me with an interest in understanding the Russian aspect of my own history to some extent. Okay, but there are other cases, I would say, like in the case of Plato and Aristotle, where it's not at all related in any way to the question of blood or ethnicity, because I have no commonality except for the broader cultural civilizational one with Plato and Aristotle. And yet I learned from them not less than I learned from the German Jew Leo Strauss or Russian Aleksandr Dugin. So there are some cases where I think it's clearly you see that, yeah, because this person has some similar circumstances to mine, I can be more on his wavelength than I would be with somebody else. But other cases where it seems less important or less related, but it doesn't detract from what you can learn from them. That's all.
Yes, but it just the things I'm gonna say once again. It's because of position. If the person sharing the same life and the same history as you, it immediately makes sense in terms of parallel that we are getting along because we share the same uh, geometry, conceptual geometry, right? And for me, as a person, as an Asian person in Russia, it just makes absolute sense. Uh, and in short, because of the position. And position, it's biology, it's personal life, history, sentence, and all of that. So yeah, that's the way they explicate it.
Okay.
But
That's
yes, and also one thing, as I said, that this is very trivial, but can you? How is it possible to listen to a philosopher, right, who is like a drug addict or alcoholic, doing something wrong, but he's telling everything right and fine.
mm-hmm.
It makes sense. He is absolutely correct, but his life is completely garbage. I wouldn't listen to this person. For me,
Yeah,
do you
that's a
agree?
good question. I don't. That's it's a good question, and it comes up. I've had conversations with people on this topic recently, but not about philosophy, more about poetry, because there are some great poets, let's say, who lived lives that you wouldn't want to copy. You wouldn't want your friends or your family members to have those lives. But at the same time, from out of those lives, they produced poetry that you would never want to erase from the world. That they
Poetry is
bring.
not philosophy.
Poetry is not philosophy, but it's an example of the fact that even from certain circumstances that are
It's
not,
a
let's
bad
say,
example
well, why is it a bad example?
because it doesn't make any parallel. It's just two separate lines. It is as if
No,
I would compare it was.
no, they're
I
not two
don't
separate
agree.
lines. Philosophy, come on, as somebody who reads Heidegger and the question of philosophy and poetry, they're very closely related. Okay, because take Plato's Republic. In the context of Plato's Republic, which in some sense is largely concerned with the presentation of philosophy, you have a crucial challenge to the philosophical life presented by poetry, and the poets get banished from the city and speech. And there are other places where the conflict between philosophy and poetry is the
Yes.
fundamental division. So it's not an
No.
arbitrary connection. There's an essential relationship, even if there's a difference. So
Yeah.
I think one way you could see the problem is like this. Is philosophy, okay, clearly philosophy has something to do with how we live our lives. Okay. In some sense, it teaches us about the life of action, what we do, and so on. And therefore also with morality, with ethics, with custom, with habit, and everything else like that. But is there some dimension of philosophy that is purely theoretical or speculative that doesn't fundamentally depend on action, on morality and ethics? And if there is, are those two things, must they be correlated or not? In other words, is moral philosophy essentially, in other words, by its own nature, a prerequisite for speculative philosophy or theoretical philosophy? Or is there any way in which those two things can be decoupled? So I agree with you that in general, it's a healthy attitude that you would be suspicious of somebody whose life was rotten if they're teaching you about the good life and so on. That there would be an incongruence there. Okay. Incidentally, that's the same incongruence that has many people in the West, many liberals in the West, not want to read Heidegger. Because for them, they say, you tell me you wouldn't want to learn from someone who was an alcoholic, and we tell you we don't want to learn from someone who was a Nazi. And for them, it's the same thing. We have nothing to learn from this Nazi, just like you have nothing to learn from an alcoholic. Because if he had anything to teach us, he wouldn't have been a Nazi. But that's I would say, even though it's understandable and somehow defensible at one level, clearly false in the case of Heidegger. I mean, I take that as clearly false. So on one hand, people would be preserving a kind of sanitation by not getting involved with Heidegger, because then they keep the Nazism away. But the sanitation comes at the expense of what they could genuinely learn if they studied him. So there's that kind of risk, or same with the other examples you mentioned. Like on one hand, it's a normal moral hygiene impulse to want to stay away from people whose lives look like they are suspicious or undesirable. If you knew that there wasn't anything good there also. But if there might be something good there, and if you're interested in seeing what it is, then you have to develop some sort of tolerance for situations of mixed merit, let's say. So that's how I would see that. I mean, the Heidegger example for me is a brutal one, because there are exactly many people. I had professors at the University of Toronto, Canada's best university, tell me explicitly that they will not even read Heidegger because he was a Nazi. That, I don't know, is that I don't find that really defensible.
I would say two things. First, in general, I don't think we have any controversy between between the tension that just happened. Because first, I was talking about philosophy in terms, like as I said, conceptual level, and not in terms of methodology or rhetoric. Of course, you can use poetry in terms of rhetoric and in terms of method and methodology. But for me, everything that's aligning with philosophy is like absolutely related as in the conceptual level. It's not, it's just in the way I look at the philosophy, and in the second one is just okay. These people don't understand. Who cares? Like, it's just a matter of understanding. That's it. If they just see the propaganda, okay, this person like this, this person like this, and without any research, it just says a lot of. So, who cares?
Okay, but you said you wouldn't read a philosopher who was an alcoholic?
Yes.
Okay.
Not alcoholic. It was how to say. It was an example, well, like contrast example.
Mm-hmm. So where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line between, because this person lives in this way, I'm not interested in what he has to say about philosophy?
It's just not congruent. That is why it's not consistent. He says like this, but he lives in different way.
Yeah. So I agree with you. Incongruity is a problem, but I would leave, for me personally, I have to leave open the possibility that despite the incongruity, there could be something, depending on what he's talking about, true about what he says. So in other words, that's fine. It's a normal topic, I would say, for disagreement, because one is, does philosophical understanding automatically translate into the way you live your life in a way that there's not a gap or not a slippage? Or can you understand something, basically the thesis that knowledge is virtue, if you know correctly, then you act correctly. Or can there be, what's right, but you don't do what's right? And maybe you have high hopes for the philosopher that of all people, he should be the one who most integrates what he knows with what he does. But philosophers are human too. Maybe not fully human, but they're human too. So I don't know if we can expect a one-to-one correlation always between what the philosopher knows and what he does. But as I say, I think it's a healthy impulse to be suspicious of somebody who has a big disconnection between what he's talking about and how he lives.
And the last thing, I just want to hear your Russian language. Can you say something?
I'm self-conscious because I have I speak it with an accent and all the other things, and I don't speak it very often. So,
well, I'm
okay,
not
fine.
a native speaker.
Fine, Читайте Платона. That's my Russian.
Oh, that's nice.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Okay, we're running out of time. That was great. So
Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for the conversation.
yeah, thank you for everything, Michael.
All right.
See you later, maybe.
All right.
Okay.
Take care.